Okay, so today we are moving on to the next minor prophet as seen in the Bible, which is Nahum. And I will not even try to announce or pronounce it the way the Hebrew with the because I can't do that. It just comes out like I'm choking on something. So let's talk a little bit about Nahum. It's only 3 chapters long. It's pretty short, so we'll be pretty concise on this one today. But it says he was an Elkoshite. Now, it can't be confirmed. There's a lot of debate about this, but many scholars actually believe that this is a reference to the fact that Nahum was from Capernaum. Because the place, and this is the place, as we know, where Jesus spent, a headquarters for his ministry for a season. The name Capernaum actually means the village of Nahum. So all the debate kind of leads people, most scholars, to believe that that's the vicinity of which he came from. And it's believed he ministered around 650 BC. And when he wrote this book, he saw a vision, and he wrote a very, very vivid and poetic detail of what he saw in that vision. And I'll lay out a little bit of that poetic style toward the end. But it's believed that Nahum's assignment was to announce the downfall and destruction of one of Israel's most aggressive and worst oppressors, Nineveh, which was also the capital of Assyria. So this would have been a message that Jonah would have really gotten behind. Like, now it's time for destruction. Let's do this, right? He would have loved to have preached this message. But notice in verse 1, Nahum addresses the burden against Nineveh. Very important not to move past that, because this wasn't delivered with the attitude that Jonah might have displayed when we left off in his book. I knew it, they didn't deserve it, right? The use of the word burden means that the message came with sorrow and grief on behalf of God. So we can't miss that point, okay? Nahum was to deliver the message of coming destruction to Nineveh when they were at their most powerful state as a nation. No one rivaled them in status and power and wealth and strength. So can imagine them listening. They're going, yeah, whatever. Who's going to take us down, right? So in Hebrew, Nahum means comfort or consolation. And we'll talk more about this in a moment, but understand that while Nahum highlights the sovereignty of God and emphasizes his power and desire to bring down evil and prideful empires, it should come as a great comfort to Judah. That is why his name means comfort. He's bringing comfort to Judah by professing this prophecy, because it's emphasizing the promise of Israel's deliverance from their enemies, and that should bring them comfort. So the culture Nahum faced, this was 150 years after Jonah showed up, walked through the streets of this powerful nation saying, repent in 40 days or you will be destroyed, right? 150 years after what scholars say is one of the largest revivals of a nation in history to ever turn to God. But over time, over those 150 years, the hearts that were once changed, once turned back to God, have now turned back away from God. Children grew up, repentance morphed back to repeating the sins of their fathers. But not only back to where they were, scholars say that at this point in time, Nineveh was even worse morally, if you can imagine that, than it was at the time of Jonah, and that was really bad. Assyria was one of the first massive and powerful empires, and they gained their power through evil and barbaric ways. And we'll talk a little bit and remind you a little bit about that in a minute. But they were violent in ways that the world had never seen up until now. So much so that in 612, God will keep his word and will destroy this evil empire. And ironically enough, God uses another pagan nation, another enemy of Israel, to destroy them, which I find is interesting, where it's like the enemies are killing off each other and Israel remains protected, right? Just a cool picture. So let's do a brief overview of the book of Nahum. Chapter 1, destruction by God is inescapable. It's kind of the theme. God told Jonah the Ninevites were worth saving, remember? They deserved his mercy, but now that mercy has ran out and judgment is now inevitable, and Nahum gets to paint the picture of their destruction to come. But notice how, if you've read through it, and we'll go through little bits of the verses, before describing the destruction, Nahum begins his prophecy by describing the character of God who will bring the judgment, which to me stresses the importance of understanding who God is before trying to understand what God does. Because what he does is always based on who he is. His wrath and discipline makes sense when you base it on the description that Nahum offers in the first chapter. And the first few verses are actually God repeating what he said after the Exodus, when the Israelites fell almost immediately into worshiping the golden calf. So a lot of these are words of God's description of himself that are being repeated again. So verse 2, the Lord is a jealous and avenging God. So this is a perfect form of jealousy, not a human jealousy, right? Our jealousy is usually of others, while God's jealousy is for us. God is called jealous almost about 19 times, depending on the version that you read in Scripture. And it's because he refuses to share the human heart. He wants that human heart connection solely for himself. He wants no rivals, simply because, not because he's selfish, but because no one can rival him. Nobody can rival his plan of redemption and salvation. No one can rival his protection and his comfort. No one can rival his mercy, right? So he's jealous for us so that we experience all of him, right? Verse 2 continues, the Lord is avenging and wrathful. The Lord takes vengeance on his adversaries and keeps wrath for his enemies. So it's isolated. His wrath is isolated to those who turn against him. Verse 3, the Lord is slow to anger and great in power. Notice both of those characteristics that were intentionally put together. Slow to anger and great in power. He's furious at this point. We know that based on the fact that judgment is now about to come. But it took a long time for him to get to that point. It takes a long time before he acts and displays his great power of judgment or justice. And it continues, verse 3, the Lord will by no means clear the guilty. Again, this is an understanding of his character. Why is justice and punishment necessary? Because God cannot deny himself. So again, we have to understand the character of God, who he is, to understand what he is doing and make sense of it. And in fact, according to verse 7, the Lord, it says, is good. And despite his wrath, despite all of these things, he is good. He is a stronghold in the day of trouble. He knows those who take refuge in him. I love this because not only is the justice side of God addressed, but so is his goodness. And only God can properly and perfectly balance goodness and mercy with justice and wrath. Only God in his perfect will can do that. But notice at the end of verse 7, where I just read, it says that God knows those who take refuge in him, those who find protection in him. He knows those who seek his goodness. But to know them, again, isn't just to, oh, I am aware of your presence. I know your name. But in Hebrew, this word actually means to have a loving communion. I know you intimately. We've talked about that before. But I love how Charles Spurgeon elaborates on this one verse. He says, God knows us. He knows our prayers and tears. He knows our wishes. He knows that we are not what we want to be, but he knows what we desire and who we desire to be. He knows our aspirations, our sighs, our groans, our secret longings, and our own chastenings of spirit when we fail. He has entered into it all. I love how Charles Spurgeon says that. He has entered into all of those. That's how he intimately knows us. He's experiencing them with us. Charles Spurgeon continues. He says, "Yes, dear child, I know all about you. I have been with you when you thought you were alone. I have read what you could not read, the secrets of your own heart that you could not decipher. I have known them all, and I still know them." I just love that description. This is about God saying, I am good for those who are in communion with me. This verse refers to the comfort as defined by Nahum's name. The people of Israel should find comfort that they are known by God, and they find protection from his vengeance by residing in his presence. The same is not true for those who turn their back on God. Because verse 8 continues, "But with an overflowing flood, he will make a complete end of his adversaries and will pursue his enemies into darkness." This was a prophetic word of what was to happen to Assyria. Nahum prophesied this in 650 BC. And remember, I said it was in 612, only a few decades later, that they were destroyed. But what happened was the Tigris River that ran alongside of the capital of Nineveh flooded. And it overwhelmed the city of Nineveh. And as a result of that flood, the city wall of Nineveh was compromised for about a 2.5-mile stretch. That wall in that area began to erode. This is what made it extremely easy for the Babylonians to break through this massive wall with relative easiness, allowing them to put an end to the Assyrian Empire. So this was the overwhelming flood was a prophetic word of what is to come. Now the rest of the chapter 1, goes back and forth describing the fate of the nations who are evil and arrogant, and then compares that with the fate of the faithful remnant. And when God brings down all the arrogant empires, he will provide refuge for the few that remain faithful and humble. So it's a back and forth for the rest of that. And many say that this whole book is only about Nineveh, but I found a couple of scholars that say it's actually more, because nowhere in chapter 1 is Nineveh or Assyrians addressed. That doesn't come until chapter 2. Chapter 1 is more of a general promise that all evil nations will be dealt with at some point. As a prophetic book, it's pointing toward the end of times as well, where all evil nations, arrogant nations, will be annihilated and wiped out. But for Nahum, the fall of Nineveh and the Assyrians is to be presented as an example of how God is at work in every age of history. And this characteristic of God's long-running patience will run out, and he will deal with all arrogant and all violent nations that are against him by the end of time. So it's prophetic in different ways, if that makes sense. Chapter 2 is the destruction of Nineveh described. So Nahum now turns the focus onto this current nation that God is choosing to deal with at this time in history. And he vividly depicts the fall of Nineveh and the battle that will occur in very progressive stages. And we see this from verses 3 through 5, just a nutshell version. It talks about the frontline invasion of Babylonian soldiers. They are the first ones to come in. Then comes the racing chariots charging through the city, doing all the damage they can do. Next, the city walls are penetrated which were massive. Remember how massive they were? 3 wide chariots. Chariots 3 wide could race across these walls, right? But they were penetrated because they had been eroding because of the flood that was promised, right? So the remaining soldiers, not the frontline soldiers, the remaining soldiers would penetrate through there. They would overtake the city, and at that point is when the people were beginning to be slaughtered. Now, verse 10 describes the scene. It says, desolate, desolation and ruin. Hearts melt and knees tremble. Anguish is in all loins. All faces grow pale. This is referring to a once powerful, arrogant people. Nahum is describing not only the life of the city fading away, but also the life of the bodies as they grow pale and life drains from them. And according to original Hebrew of verse 10, Nineveh says it was empty, desolate, and waste. Now, I told you I'd bring in a little bit of that poetic explanation. I found this very interesting because in Hebrew, empty, desolate, and waste, I'm not going to butcher their names, but if you hear them in Hebrew, they sound very similar. They are onomatopoetic. If you've ever gone through English, you'll know what that means, but I'll explain what onomatopoetic means. They are words that are phonetically imitate the sound that they describe. So for us, it would be words like bat or bang or crash or buzz, okay, or roar. We can auditorially understand what is being experienced by hearing those words, right? It enhances the auditory experience in the language that you're reading, right? So these words, empty, desolate, and waste, being in Hebrew, they actually illustrate more than just a visual, but also a sense of what would be heard when Nahum was writing this and speaking this. By Hebrew description, Nahum was communicating not only a picture of a fallen Nineveh, but also the sound. And the sound that he is using when he says empty, desolate, and waste describes shattering pottery all around in mass form. So just imagine one breaking plate. Imagine thousands of breaking plates all over, everywhere. That's the sound that he's communicating as a process of this devastation, okay? It's a deafening and piercing commotion in the process of the Assyrians falling. I just found that so interesting that in poetic terms, what he is saying is so much more than just a visual. But then after all this finally came the plundering, and in verse 9, Nahum alludes to the endless treasure of wealth that the Babylonians were able to help themselves to. That brings us to chapter 3, destruction deserved. So Nahum, while focusing on Nineveh in chapter 2, now refers to explore the downfall of the empire as a whole. So it wasn't just Nineveh. Nineveh fall led to the fall of the entire Assyrian empire. But he announces a woe in verse 1 of chapter 3, describing how this nation was built on bloodshed of innocent. He says, "Woe to the bloody city, all full of lies and plunder, no end to the prey." Injustice was their battle cry. Injustice is how they built their nation of wealth and prosperity. Their own violence and barbaric ways that they practice is what leads to the way in which they will now be destroyed. Because remember, the Ninevites were known for displaying their own enemies on the streets, right? I will not go into the brutal detail that I have studied learning about this, but remember, they would string up their corpses like fish. They would skin their captives, lay them in the scorching sun for a torturous death. They even made furniture coverings with that skin. They were brutal. They made pillars of heads of those that were killed when they beheaded them. So brutal isn't a good enough word. So I only say this to say that the way in which they built their nation is the way in which God will allow them to fall. Because now they're going to get what's coming to them. And it's deserved, right? Verse 3 is a picture of what the Babylonians leave behind. It says, hosts of slain, heaps of corpses, dead bodies without end. They stumble over the bodies. It creates a picture of them falling in the way that they had so often brutally done to others, right? But much of chapter 3 is actually Nahum mocking the people of Nineveh. challenging them to do their best to fight against this coming judgment, but it's not going to work. Prepare as you desire, it won't do any good. You cannot stand up against the judgment of God. In fact, in verse 13, it says it all. He says, behold, your troops are women in your midst. That would have been a very, very degrading thing to say to a man at that point in time, right? You claim to be warriors, but you're just a bunch of women. You're weak and helpless. And then Nahum ends with a taunting illustration addressing the actual king of the empire, who will lay alone as he faces death. No one coming to his rescue, no one coming to his aid. Instead, there will be celebration over his death. Verse 19 says, all who hear the news about you, talking about the king of Assyria, all who hear the news about you clap their hands over you, for upon whom has not come your unceasing evil. So because Nineveh was so renowned for its violence and cruelty, it will be inevitable that all the other nations applaud when this king in that city is judged and destroyed. Overall, a bit of a gloomy book. But it's important to understand that this is a testament about the grief that God carries, first and foremost, because it started with the burden, right? And it's a burden that he carries over having to lay out this judgment. But once again, it's also about God addressing those who remain humble, who remain in line with him, and they will find comfort and protection from that judgment. So all that to say, the guilty will not remain unpunished and the faithful will remain protected all the way until when final judgment comes, when Christ returns. And there's that final battle. I love how one scholar summed it up. He said, for Nahum and for us today, we take comfort in knowing that the judgments of the Lord are faithful and true. What he's promised he will do. We don't need to envy the unrighteous or seek vengeance against them ourselves. Nahum shows us that God is more than able to take care of them and us according to what he has promised. So that's a nutshell version of the vision and message of Nahum. And while we could focus, and we could, and we should, and we probably will, for our closing discussion, we can focus on the goodness of God and his faithful and just ways. Or we can focus on his mercy and justice with purity and perfection and how he does that in our lives as well. But I also want us to ponder another aspect of this story that is often missed. How is it the people of Nineveh went from a great revival to a great ruin in such a seemingly short amount of time? 150 years before, Nineveh was a changed nation. From the king down to the peasant and the poor, they all repented and turned from their evil ways. But barely 3 to 4 generations pass, and they have fallen back into previous ways of living, wicked and idolatrous. So the mercy of God now goes from mercy to wrath. Time-wise, I thought about this. It would be identical to my own family experience. So my parents, at some point in their adult life with 4 children, repented and decided to follow Jesus. Then they raised me and my 3 siblings in the church, exposing us to truth. Then my siblings and I, who all had kids, raised our kids in the church. And now my kids are adults, as well as my siblings' kids. They're adults and they're having kids. And it would have been the hope and prayer of my parents that 4 generations or even 5 generations later, they're all still following Jesus. But are they? No, because I literally did kind of an overall assessment of my family, writing down all the names of all my siblings, and there's a lot. There are great grandkids in my family for my mom. And when I really highlighted who is still with Jesus, I would say less than 25% of my family have remained faithful and devoted followers. And I mean faithful, humble, devoted, committed followers, not just I'm a Christian by name. Living their lives humble before God. Yet all were given the same exposure to a loving and merciful God. So what happens over time that can cause faith and devotion to Jesus to erode? I think we've all heard the phrases, time can be your friend, but time can also be your enemy. So how in our faith do we make time our friend, not our enemy? Sometimes having time is good. We want time to ponder big decisions, right? We want time to pray or seek advice. We invest in things, and over time, those investments can grow and be beneficial, right? We know a lot of times it takes time to heal, but we also know that time can be bad. I literally thought about this. I'm like, Dolly Parton, sorry, I have to quote Dolly Parton. She said, time marches on, and sooner or later you realize it's marching across your face. Because time can be very harsh and hard, right? When the passing of time causes something that was once special and cherished to become ordinary and common and underappreciated, time is bad. It happens in marriages and relationships. It happens in jobs. It happens in church experiences. I've seen so many people come to a church and I'm like, this is awesome. 5, 10 years, I need something new, right? But what happens within the context of time that a once vibrant and exciting relationship with Jesus can become mundane and non-existent or taken for granted? I'm asking a lot of questions because we are going to have a time of worship, and I want us to really ponder these things. So I'm going to ask more questions than solutions right now. What occurred over those 4 generations of Ninevites that eroded their trust and faith in God? What diminished their reverence and fear of God that caused such an instantaneous change? And do we as Christians today run the same risk? From going from a heart revived to a heart in ruin. So before we judge the Ninevites' decline back into sinful behavior, the same thing is happening in Christianity, especially in America. It's happening. I mean, I even remember as a teenager, I was unstoppable in my faith. I was bold, I was confident, I was certain of God's voice and presence in my life. My purpose was undeniable. Nobody could shake my faith. But time and life circumstances, right? 2 Timothy 4:7, Paul writes this, I have fought the good fight. I have finished the race. I have kept the faith. I love that verse. But isn't it challenging to accomplish that? To finish our faith journey well? Maybe not for all of us in the room, but if not for us, for people we know, right? What is it that happens throughout time, through the course of life, that can erode the faith of a believer? I'm going to throw out a few things to chew on, and again, we're going to come back to this discussion, but culture, right? Cultural influences. Many attempt to serve culture and God at the same time, but we can't do that. It's that age-old question in culture that culture is asking now what Satan asked Eve in the garden. Did God really say that? Did God really say there's only 2 genders? Did God really say, I could go on and on and on. But that's what culture is wanting us to believe, right? Personal hardships. Our faith cannot be dependent on our circumstances, but many have this false belief that hardships is the absence of God's presence. Busyness in our life. We get so busy with things of the world that we are not busy with the things of God. And then another one is we find substitutes for God. We develop habits, or we choose people or other things to run to for comfort or security or purpose or identity, right? All of these things cause a drift in our loyalty and devotion to God. I want to hear more suggestions from you guys. And I want to hear how God has encouraged you and challenged you to keep the faith, because we need to talk about these things. Without identifying the possible culprits, we run the risk of falling victim as well. So we can go from revival to ruin, or we can go from revival to restoration. And time can either be on our side or time can be against us, depending on how we spend our time between repentance and when Jesus comes back. Why does this matter? Why did I even bring this up? Because if you fast forward to Romans 11:22, we should be motivated to remain in God's will until with his covenant at its fullest. Because in Romans 11:22 it says, "Note then the kindness and the severity of God." Severity toward those who have fallen, but kindness to you, provided you continue in his kindness. Otherwise, you too will be cut off. We can drift and not even know we've drifted without intentionality. We can replace God without even knowing we've done it, because we've become content or complacent or comfortable. In the eyes of God, though, time is a good thing, right? God has allowed a lot of time for people to turn to him and stay in relationship with him. Basically over 6,000 years thus far, he's allowed time for people to return to him. But there will be a day when that time is up. And one of my favorite things to think about is, will God say to me, "Well done, good and faithful servant"? And I'm not here to, I don't want this to be a discussion of legalism. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about engaging in the best, most richest faith that we can with the time that we are given before Jesus comes back. Does that make sense? So how do we make sure time is on our side as we journey toward Christ and not be led away? And how do we encourage others to do the same? Because we aren't here just for our own faith. We are here for the faith of others and the encouragement of others. And there will be a time toward the end of, before Christ comes, there will be an apostasy within the church. An apostasy of people saying, "I'm all done." But that apostasy doesn't necessarily mean I denounce God. It can also mean I've just denounced doing his will and his way at all times. And I feel a burden, the way God felt a burden for those who were fallen and destroyed because they didn't allow time to be on their side in Nineveh. So how can we do differently the calling that we've been placed in our life, in our purposes, in our positions of life, to make time work on behalf of our faith, not against our faith?